So we're here at the ARM TechCon. So who are you?
I'm Nathan Brookwood. I'm an industry analyst. I've been following the microprocessor business, x86, ARM, RISC, since 1995. So I've had an opportunity to watch 64 bits come to the PC world, and now coming to the ARM world. Quite an exciting time for me.
So yesterday the internet is exploding over Altera's and Intel's announcement that Intel is making ARM processors.
Yes, well, Altera announced last year that they were going to be working with Intel, and Intel is going to be making FPGAs for them using their 14 nanometer process. And Intel had said they really wanted to work with other companies to do foundry business. But in the past, when they said that, they typically excluded making products that would compete with Intel's own products. And so, for example, if a Qualcomm or Broadcom came and said, hey, Intel, make some chips for us. We use ARM cores, but you can make, we'd love to use your technology. Intel would say, thanks, but we don't make chips for people who compete with ours. So we can't work with you. Now, Altera, when they made the announcement, people said, well, that makes sense. Intel has great process technology. Altera makes FPGAs. Those don't compete in a direct way with processors or SoCs, so why not? Now, what came out yesterday is those 14 nanometer FPGAs that Altera is designing also include a quad-core Cortex-A53, a 64-bit ARM core. And so now, all of a sudden, people are going, wow, Intel is going to be turning out FPGAs with ARM cores. Isn't that amazing? Well, it is amazing, but in fact, that's still consistent with the old Intel policy of we don't make chips that compete with our own, because those FPGAs with A53s are not going to be going into devices typically where Intel could have sold an Atom or a Haswell or Broadwell or some other chip. But what's more interesting to me is that when Brian Krzanich, who's a manufacturing guy, took over from Paul Otellini, who was a marketing guy, as the CEO of Intel this spring, Brian very quietly changed Intel's policy. And now Intel is in fact willing to work with third parties, even to make chips that might compete with Intel's. And Intel's principal concern now is not whether that chip will compete with Intel's own chip, but whether or not they can structure a business relationship that's profitable for both companies. And so if a Qualcomm, a Broadcom, an NVIDIA, an AMD, or somebody else who has high volume products that are based on an ARM core should approach Intel, instead of saying thanks but no thanks, Krzanich now is of the position, he'll say, let's talk and see if we can find an equitable business deal. That's a big change.
So do you think it's quite sure it's going to happen, that Intel is going to make a whole bunch of ARM?
Well, clearly with the Altera arrangement, they've already got one customer. Now, I think these Altera FPGAs with ARM cores are not going to be a super high volume product. FPGAs are, by conventional standards, a niche market, but still a very profitable one. So the more interesting issue is whether some other high volume customer who uses ARM can structure an arrangement with Intel. I think even though Intel's now open to such an arrangement, many of its competitors would be a little bit wary of entering into such an arrangement. On the other hand, a company like Apple, who has a long and pretty positive relationship with Intel, might be amenable to that. And so if in 3 or 4 years it turned out Apple was working with Intel on a foundry basis for a future Apple processor based on Apple-designed 64-bit ARM cores, I wouldn't be a bit surprised. Now, of course, if that happens, they won't tell anybody about it until it's a done deal and they're shipping the products. That's the way Apple works, and I'm sure Intel would have to work that way as well. But I think of all the various opportunities I would see for high-volume products based on ARM that Intel might manufacture, Apple's the likeliest candidate.
It's Intel knows how to do it, right? They are able to do it, right? They have the engineers, they have the money, they can design great ARM processors, right?
Intel certainly can design great processors, and I don't think that Intel is going to be designing any ARM processors soon. They actually had a division that they got from Digital Equipment back in 1998, and were manufacturing Intel SoCs based on the strong ARM processor. That basically turned out to be something of a distraction for Intel. They couldn't quite reconcile it with their x86 business, and ultimately they sold that to Marvell. So I don't think Intel's going to go back into designing ARMs, but I can see them being in the foundry business, manufacturing ARMs.
So you don't see them as designing, but when you have fab, you need to kind of like be in the business of designing ARM, right? Because you have to provide the tools, or whatever it's called, for whoever wants to tape them out.
Well, the same tools that you use to design an Atom processor or a Haswell processor also apply to designing ARM processors. And Intel, although it has some proprietary design tools in its library, also has a lot of third-party design tools. So it's quite conceivable that if you were an Apple or a Qualcomm and were designing ARM processors, you could work with Intel to get those designs manufactured in an Intel fab. So I don't see, and I certainly don't see Intel moving to do any kind of ARM design. That's not a key core competency for them, whereas manufacturing is obviously a core competency, and as a result of the increasing importance of Atom in their product mix, SoCs are a core competency.
So you don't think ARM? You don't think Intel wants to make processors for smartphones and tablets and Internet of Things and smart TVs? They don't care about this market?
Oh no, they certainly care about that
because what they're doing doesn't work.
Well, that's why I think Intel structuring manufacturing arrangements with people who are doing those designs would give them a way to participate in those markets and make a lot of money, on the assumption that the advanced process technology that Intel develops for its own x86 processors also is equally applicable to to manufacturing ARM products. Not necessarily the commodity ones. I don't think you're going to make a bunch of M0s at Intel. But if you have a high-end ARM-based product and you're willing to pay the top dollar for the wafers to be manufactured at Intel, then Intel now will talk to you. That's still a big change.
So I, of course, don't know how things work, but I can imagine that Intel has so much R&D cash, it's huge R&D, so many engineers, talented engineers. I would guess that they put them to work and they actually do have a secret ARM license or whatever, and they have designs. It doesn't mean that they will release them, right? But they have them and they are experimenting with it, and they might release if the CEO says let's do it. They could do it, right?
Yeah, Intel spends an enormous amount of money on R&D every year. About half of that money goes into advancing process technology, new ways to make chips. The other half goes into designing new x86-based chips, big ones for servers, medium-sized one for notebook and desktop clients, and very tiny ones for smartphones, tablets, and the like. And so they have they have that expertise. I think they may even still have an ARM architectural license lying around from the days when they were designing and selling strong ARM-based products. But I don't see that the ARM product line really fits well into Intel's own internal design and marketing efforts. But that doesn't mean that the manufacturing resources can't be used to make ARM products as well as x86-based products. And I think that as Intel looks for more opportunities to take advantage of the growth in mobility and Internet of Things, suppliers who need Intel's advanced technology may find that a marriage where the supplier or another third party does the design and markets the chips but uses Intel as a manufacturing resource becomes more common.
Do you think Intel is pretty angry at the media talking about all the things that they've been talking about since yesterday? Do you think that the PR is panicking right now? Or?
Oh, no. I think Intel's manufacturing prowess is second to none. And so when the deal with Altera gets more attention and people realize that Altera, who's a leading company in a different semiconductor sector, finds Intel to be an attractive manufacturing partner, that helps Intel, especially given Brian Krasinich's feeling that Intel needs to do more foundry business, because as a manufacturing guy, he understands the importance of keeping his factories filled.
So, Otellini was replaced, or is, like, normally they always say, you know, that they decide to go on a holiday, or, you know, whatever they say. But what's the problem at Intel? There was a problem, right? I mean, there's a problem.
No, well, Paul Otellini told the Intel board late in 2012 that he wanted to move on and Intel needed to find a new CEO. That process took about 6 months, and they replaced Paul with Brian Krasinich, who was the VP of manufacturing and actually had the title inside Intel prior to that of Chief Operating Officer. So it was the succession took place a little bit earlier. Most people had presumed prior to Otellini's announcement that he would be there for a few more years, but for whatever reason, Paul decided it was time to move on. There's been a lot of debate as to whether he was encouraged to move on or decided himself. Intel has steadily maintained that this was Otellini's decision and nobody was forcing him into it. In some sense, Intel was doing reasonably well in the markets it had served, although people typically have said Intel could have done better and should have moved sooner in mobility, but that's always, I think, a difficult kind of decision for any company that has such a dominant position in other market segments to make.
But the stock value or the profits or the revenue or something hasn't been quite what they would have wanted, right?
I think Intel, after many years of demonstrating high single-digit growth in revenues and profits, excuse me, has hit upon a patch where the PC market is not growing, and Intel's revenues have been more or less flat, and its profits have been more or less flat, and the stock price has been more or less flat. Yeah, that certainly is the case. I'm not a financial analyst, so I really can't comment on the results beyond of making those kind of very superficial observations. But I do think that Intel is now looking for new areas to grow. For example, at IDF, they announced a new product concept called Quark, based on a very small x86 core, and they're working with third parties to use this new Quark device in Internet of Things kind of products. So they have a number of irons in the fire for future growth.
the number of threats, and the threats are intensifying, right? And the board of directors is looking at the threats and saying, oh, we need to do something, right?
When you are the #1 semiconductor company in the world, there are always going to be people who are looking to take some of your market share away. That's just a given when you have leading market share. And so that, I think, is what's going on there. And there'll always be lots of threats. Intel has been a company that has weathered threats successfully over the years. They've made some major changes in product strategy. Back in 1980, they were a dominant memory supplier. They saw they couldn't make money in memories anymore, and they shifted to a whole different, lineup and strategy with microprocessors that served them well for 30 years. I think it will continue to serve them well. But clearly the market and the industry are changing, and I think now we're seeing Intel move in new directions. And I would say manufacturing chips that have competing processor cores is definitely a new direction. Expanding its foundry business and building on its strengths in manufacturing is clearly a new direction, and I think we'll see more changes like that over the coming years.
Excuse me. Because the ARM Chromebooks are pretty awesome and getting better, and the ARM servers are about to arrive. And Intel is not getting any traction on smartphones or tablets.
Well, they would argue that they have gone from 0% to 2 or 3%, but clearly ARM has a very strong position in those markets. Intel has a pretty strong position in servers, and even though there will be ARM-based servers coming on the scene, Intel, with its Avoton and Centerton products, is also gaining some traction there. And so I think there's going to be good competition. As an analyst, I love to see competition. I think customers love to see competition. But especially with some of the server initiatives that Intel has begun talking about in the last 6 months with silicon photonic interconnects and the like, it's too soon to write Intel's epitaph in the server business.
But the ARM license is so cheap, no? Why not just make ARM processors?
Well, because Intel believes that having a common architecture top to bottom, from microservers to enterprise servers to high performance computing, even vector processing based on x86 cores in its Xeon Phi series, all of that represents real value and simplifies the life of people who are running data centers, writing software for these app market segments. And unless something really significant happens to change that, Intel will continue to pursue with very laser-like focus x86 in all the market segments that it serves. That's where it has traditionally had the most strength, and there's no reason yet to assume that that strategy is flawed.
So if they want to do more ARM, let's say, is it just the CEO needs to decide and that's it? Or is there more to deciding to do something like that?
Well, I think if Intel decided it wanted to integrate ARM processors into its own product line, then obviously that would be a major decision both on the CEO and a whole bunch of the senior managers in the company, and then they'd need to acquire the right skills to be able to be successful in that market. But right now they think they can do that. They argue that they can match ARM in terms of performance per watt, and that they don't need to abandon or expand their architectural offerings to include ARM. On the other hand, obviously, if their manufacturing prowess can be exploited by people who do use ARM cores, they're saying now that that's not an issue, that they are more than willing to work with those kind of partners.
So you're an analyst, right?
I'm an analyst.
And when you say things and the media reacts and when companies start getting interested, things happen, right?
Well,
so you do have an influence on what happens?
I think generally speaking, the role of industry analysts like me is to help third parties, be they companies or consumers, understand what these technology trends are and what they mean in terms of the evolution of the industry. And right now, for example, Intel's change in policy with regard to working with third parties, even if it means making chips that compete with Intel's, was not well understood. And I, through a couple of comments I've made in the last week, I'm trying to help people understand that the industry is changing, Intel's changing, and that there are new opportunities, perhaps, as a result of that.
And they're going to be talking about this in the next board meeting.
They're going to be saying, yeah, that Brookwood guy, where did he get that crazy idea? And Krasinich will have to say, well, I did say that at a meeting. And Brookwood actually followed up and said, can I talk about that? And Intel said, yes. And believe you me, I would not be talking about this if I didn't have an email from Intel saying, it's okay, Nathan, you can talk about that publicly.